grad student. Welcome to part 2 of this giant episode all about being disabled in grad school. Part 1 was released on Monday, December 7th, and if you want to know what the heck we've already talked about for 50 minutes, I highly recommend checking that episode out first. Anyways, today's episode is all about burning down this... it's all about being disabled in grad school and ableism with the wonderful grad students who run the Dis in Grad School Twitter account, 6th year Biological Sciences PhD candidate Cait Kayden, and 2nd year Developmental Psychology PhD student Kayden Stockwell. I want to call this How to Not Be an Asshole, but I'm not going to call it that. I'll call it something more useful, and I should stop swearing this episode. I'm going to have to flag it as explicit.
I was about to point out that you started out with I never swear, but I'm going to allow myself to swear just one time. And now we're 15 swears in.
You know what happened? I got passionate. And when I get passionate, my filter goes. I will reel it back simply because this goes through professional circles and I'm very aware of that. I don't know. I think that there are a couple F words in there that I think were very appropriate in my personal opinion, but no, you're totally right. I called myself out I never do this, and now we're you're
only
right.
Only one. I'll allow myself just one.
I'm glad this topic has inspired the passion.
Yes.
Oh yeah. All right, so Cait, go ahead and give us the poll. Let's jump back in.
Yeah. So one of the polls I was really excited about, and I say excited about because it was relevant to me, and I wanted to kind of have other people to commiserate with, I guess. The question was, if you have ever considered taking a leave of absence from grad school due to disability, chronic illness, or mental health, did your ability to pay for healthcare factor into your decision? And so here we had an N of 27, and 74% of those respondents said that yes, it factored into their decision, and they stayed in grad school. They didn't take a leave of absence.
A leave of absence they needed or wanted.
Exactly, yeah. 12.8% said yes, and they still took leave. And then only 11.1% said that no, they didn't factor in being able to pay for healthcare when they were thinking about taking a leave of absence. And why this is so relevant is that for a lot of people who are struggling with their disability or being diagnosed, oftentimes the first thing that your advisor or your director of graduate studies or the chair of your department might tell you is you should take a leave of absence. But the problem with that is that if you're needing to pay for healthcare, and we did a poll, and grad students spend a lot of money on healthcare, if you are needing to use health insurance, and I think it was something for 68% of grad students, their health insurance was tied to their enrollment status as a grad student. And so if you're thinking about taking a leave of absence, you might lose your health insurance if you take that leave, but you also, often it's an unpaid leave of absence. And so you lose your stipend. And so if you get sick like I did, and you're trying to figure out what's wrong, and then everybody tells you, you should definitely figure out what's wrong, go leave, lose your health insurance, and lose your income, it means that you will never get better again because you will not be able to go and figure out what's wrong. And those were just staggering and numbers that 74% factored in the cost, but had to stay because of that factor, I thought was unbelievable.
I mean, and it even makes me think about the people that said no. I wonder how old those people were, because if they're under 26 and covered by their parents' insurance, that could explain why they said no. So that number might be even smaller in terms of the only reason they didn't have to worry about it is because it was still covered under their parents, because there are grad students under the age of 26. That's why they didn't have to worry about it, but otherwise they're screwed. I even think about when I got to grad school and I got I had health insurance from my parents, but started to be an adult and use it in terms of like checkups or like
Uh-huh.
go to the dermatologist, you have acne and you're 24, things like that, I was suddenly like, oh, this is expensive to go to a checkup still. And I was confused by that, not to mention people who have regular doctor's appointments for like specialists that, right, they're regularly seeing, which is like, let me say, a normal thing. It's astonishing that like A, healthcare was factoring into that. B, with healthcare, it's still expensive. And then some departments are more accommodating than others. I know that my department is like, yeah, go on leave, but we'll give you like a grading TA that's like, just try to get it in. Or like if people need to take full leaves, I've still heard of people kind of being covered. They'll just put them on like an RA. So it really depends. And like, again, this is my own anecdotal, whatever.
Yeah.
This is... This, I do not speak for my university or my department, but just to say that I think it really, really varies, because I have seen absolute horror stories online where people have talked about accommodations not being met, or like, again, like you said, the encouragement of leave without abled professors realizing what the implications of that leave means. Like, mom and dad are not necessarily millionaires hanging out who can just like fund you to be leaving.
Or, I mean, you might not interact with your parents. You might,
Yes.
I mean, you might also interact with them, but you are actually helping to support them financially, right?
Exactly.
Like there are so many complicating ways in which we should just, I don't know. Personally, I think we should burn the whole system down.
Burn it down. Yeah, I'm definitely on the side of burn it down. This is, I like joke every couple episodes will be like really hit some themes and like, we can call this the Burn It Down podcast.
Yes!
This is the Burn It Down episode. So I'm definitely, I mean, I fall in the same place. And I think that it's like, as I think about why don't other people see this who are abled? Like, why don't people care? And part of me is like, well, this is a really uncomfortable realization to understand that you are like basically dehumanizing and holding people back with full power. Like, you have full power not to, and you are, consciously or not. It's a really uncomfortable thing. And when I think about the psychology of it, I'm like, oh yeah, no, this makes total sense. It's not less disgusting, but like it makes total sense. I'll also say that I think that there are a lot of well-meaning people who just don't know where to look with this. And so when we even thinking about like the advocacy piece, which I know we'll get to in a moment here, of like, there I think is a role for especially abled students to bring awareness to their departments who may be very well intentioned but don't see it. Or who might maliciously not be seeing it, like you don't know where they fall. So my personal stance, as we'll find out here in a few minutes, is that I think that abled students have a responsibility in trying to close that gap. But before we do that, I know, Kayden, there was a poll that you wanted to share as well in terms of some staggering numbers that you had noticed just from some of the results.
Yeah, so in part of talking about some of the like barriers to accessing accommodations for grad students, and that maybe a little bit of a specific problem to grad students is that grad students often inhabit multiple roles. We are students taking classes, but we are also TAs or instructors of record teaching classes. We are also in labs or doing archival work. And then there's also a phase where we are, we finished coursework. So we're only doing research. We have oral exams or comprehensive exams. So there's a lot of sort of beyond just you are a student in a class taking accommodations. There's a lot broader range of things that you might need to access these different roles that you are sort of contractually obligated to fill. In my personal experience and then hearing on the internet, disability services office don't necessarily know how to sort of manage these different roles. So one poll we asked is if you have been a teaching assistant or an instructor of record, have you needed accommodations in that role as a TA or instructor of record? And this poll did have very few responses, had about 10 people, for a couple of different reasons that I could sort of imagine. But for that poll, about 60% of the people who needed accommodations for their role as a TA did not receive accommodations. And so only about 20% of people who needed TA accommodations were actually able to get those accommodations for their teaching position. And, that could reflect things such as the office didn't know how to grant those accommodations, or they saw them as unreasonable, because there's this whole rhetoric around, we have to grant you reasonable accommodations. Who gets to decide what's reasonable?
Yeah, back to the conversation of like who's granting this and why,
exactly.
And what right do they potentially have or not. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
And then you also have potentially playing into this small number of responses to this poll is grad students who may not register with the Office of Disability Services for fears of stigma or access to the documentation needed, or these sort of feelings of not disabled enough, as an indicator of what is happening in terms of accommodations for these non-classwork accommodations is sort of concerning of how accessible is the academy when you're not just solely sitting in a class as a student in all of these other roles that you have to fulfill.
Yeah, and I'm even thinking like how messed up that really is to be like, we're going to give you a job that pays you to do this, which is great, and provides healthcare, which is great. But we're not going to make it accessible for you to do the job in the way that other people are able to do the job, whether it be like there are just logistical roadblocks that I have the power to fix, but I'm not going to. Now go do the job. Like, it doesn't make sense. And let me get back on my point. Still illegal. And right, I mean, we think about they make it not illegal by being like it's not reasonable, or they make it less illegal by being like, oh, that's not possible, we can't, so try to make it, more accommodate your accommodations for us, essentially. But it's really complex and it's really messed up because it's tied into your ability to pay for grad school, and it's tied into your ability to have that healthcare, which really goes back to Cait's point. I mean, like another word that's popped into my mind is like, it's very easy for universities to abuse disabled grad students.
I mean, the point is, it's really easy for universities to abuse grad students. It's very common for universities to abuse grad students. It's just even easier to abuse disabled grad students because, again, to kind of return to that question earlier about like what happens if you don't get an accommodation, what do you have to do? Well, especially I'm in a STEM field. In my field, you have one advisor.
Yes.
And so if you need accommodations and your one advisor doesn't give them to you, what do you do? Now, in other fields, you might have like a team of advisors or like a group. And so it might be a little bit easier to just slowly back away from one advisor and go towards another. But again, this is an issue that impacts all grad students. We should have a bigger mentoring network. There should not just be one person who gets to decide your entire career for you. But that it's so much worse for disabled grad students if you just happen to get an advisor who doesn't want to give you accommodations. Who do you go to? If you complain to the chair of the department, A, your advisor could be the chair of the department, right? But B, that's their colleague. Yes. Are they going to take your side or their colleagues' side? And
either way, you become that person. Even if they agree with you, you become that person that, now they have to deal with.
Exactly. And like, well, then what is your letter of recommendation going to look like? Because your career is tied to that letter. And
it ties your disability to your career in a way that, I don't want to say shouldn't be, because a disability is not a bad thing, but what I should say is that the other person's perception of your disability is tied to your career.
Exactly. Yeah. And again, as we're talking about over and over again, there is this perception about what you should be able to do as a grad student. And so asking for these accommodations is oftentimes seen as, I think as we opened the episode with, is kind of like a weakness. Mm-hmm. But in reality, it's just you getting the thing that you need to do the job
that they've asked.
Exactly. It's just leveling the playing field. It's not extra. It's not special. It's not because you're weak. It's just giving you the same thing everybody else has.
Right. It's not giving you an advantage. It's not even, and I will use the word here, it's not even helping. It's accommodating, right? It's just the leveling. This is not giving you a one-up, right? Whereas if an abled person got the same accommodations, for example, perhaps it would be an advantage for an abled person to get an additional 20 minutes because they don't need the 20 minutes, right? A person who requires 20 minutes for a disability is the same as an able person not having the 20 minutes. That is the point.
Exactly.
As we're talking here, even when you were talking about students shouldn't just have one advisor, I'll even add on top of that, it is expected, at least where I'm at with psychology, that like you do collaborate, but it is always the student seeking out, which I think professionally, networking wise, makes a lot of sense. And it has a role. And I also think that it should not be the only way that students are gaining additional advisors. Like institutionally, we should be provided multiple. And then the ones that we're networking and reaching out, of course, that's a skill we should develop. Of course, that is something that thinking about our own record and our line of research, of course we should be doing that. But in terms of having additional people on our side, I think you're totally right. I think that there needs to be more from the institution on providing that for us, because it becomes really weird when if one thing is happening with one person and then we have to go to their colleague to call them out, and then we're the person to call them out whether or not they take it well.
Yep.
Like, it's not a good look. It's not good on us. It's not good on the person we have to call out or call out to. And man, that's complicated. And like, how do you navigate that? Often from my own perception, it's like people are giving up their needs to try to function in this like really kind of messed up system.
Yeah, I mean, I think having any kind of structure for that is really important. I don't know if Kayden wants to talk about like networking and like neurotypicality or not. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there for you.
Sure. So yeah, at my institution at least, and my undergrad as well, there'd be like the career center or even the department or whatever would hold like networking sessions or teach you how to network, and then opportunity to sort of practice, and then you legitimately gain new connections. But all of the norms of networking are very based in neurotypical sort of ways of socializing. So how outgoing you're supposed to be, and the facial expressions you're supposed to make, and the eye contact and the back and forth flow of conversation are all generally ways that non-neurotypical, for example, like autistic students, is not natural to us. And so it's very challenging, and I would go so far to say is as problematic when potentially a large part of your grad student and further career success is dependent on your ability to sort of emulate these ways of socializing that are not natural to you.
It's an excellent
point. And a lot of times, if you bring up that, networking is challenging for me, or someone notices that you're not doing it in a way that they expect, a lot of times the first suggestion will be, you should go to these networking workshops where they can teach you how to act like a neurotypical person.
Which is problematic.
Yes.
Not necessarily unhelpful in terms of like, if your goal was to fit into the norms, that would be a good suggestion. But the problem is the norms, not my inability to fit into them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that it's a good point. It makes me reflect even on what I just, responded to you, Cait, where I was like, it's a normal part that makes a lot of sense. And I'm like, I don't know, not that I would take it back. I think that when we think about like science and collaborating with, and in terms of like creating science, yes. And I would add on top of that, as I'm reflecting back on your comment, Kayden, like, again, live here as we're recording, that like what it means to and how to, and, what people should expect in terms of when somebody wants to collaborate, or what a collaborator sounds like, looks like, acts like. That to me sounds problematic. I mean, I don't know, you can feel free to disagree with me, but in terms of how I view networking as like expanding science, I think that at its core, what, the connections made are important. I think you make such a good point about how they are made, and people's ability to make those connections based on the norms is really problematic.
Yeah, and I agree. Is like, I don't disagree with this idea that we should have multiple advisors, that science should be collaborative. I very much agree that science should be collaborative. But if my ability to collaborate is contingent on my ability to make a quote unquote good impression at a network, at a good social connection, and not my ability or my scientific knowledge, then that is a barrier. That's a barrier.
Agreed. Snaps. I totally agree. And so as we're talking about all of these things, I think we've highlighted a lot of major issues, but I'm not expert on that, and I don't have polls, and I haven't put hours and hours and hours into advocacy thought about this as you two have. And so I'm curious what you both have opinion-wise or more objectively wise on like, what can abled students do to promote accessibility in their department? I know we talked a little bit before about like, when we talk about generations of students and faculty, do abled students have a role bringing this to their department? I think about like the diversity, equity, and inclusion task forces that are started on college campuses, especially after everything over this summer with George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement coming back into focus, luckily. I know from Twitter, disability is often not included in that conversation. And when people try to include it, they're either shut out or it's like, oh yeah, we'll do what we need to do to get our gold star, and then, okay, back to this, what we think is the only way to define diversity. So all of that being said, as we think about that, how can, in your mind, abled students promote accessibility better? It reminds me, just before I finish this very long-winded question, it reminds me that, like, when I talk to Black students on this podcast, I usually say, like, it's not your job to educate me. It's my job to educate myself. And so I'll say the same thing with you both. I'm not sitting here asking you so that you educate me, but rather I think it's useful on the podcast is I don't know who's listening to this. I don't know if these are going to be disabled students. I don't know if it's going to be abled students, but for the abled students listening who may have questions, what can they be doing to promote disability accessibility and disability awareness within their departments or just generally as grad students?
Well, so I will start, I guess, the answer with one of the things that you've already said, which is that disabled is not a bad word. I was recently called a grad student of disability. And I think
they tried so hard.
They tried so hard, but what they wanted to do was separate me from disabled. And it's funny because in the context, like, the disability part wasn't even the important part. Like the word really was like immunocompromised, like that was the word that we needed. But the point was that they were like so worried about calling me a bad word. But the reality is that disabled is not a bad word. We should not be using euphemisms. I will make a note that within the disability community, there is this back and forth between what's called person first and identity first, a language.
Yes.
And so a person first is like, I am a person with whatever. And then identity first is like, I am a disabled person.
Yeah. And you have heard me probably go back and forth today. So like, I'll be really clear, like in psychology, when we think about like the word like an addict or a schizophrenic, we're moving away from that. So that's where you hear my own bias, where instead I would say like a person with addiction, or a person who uses substances, or I would say like a person with schizophrenia. That's where my own language, as you have heard today, is a person with a disability. And I have been very person first. And I think it is, depending on how a person, like some people identify with, and some people say it's part of them and not their whole self, or however you want to word it. Like I would say I'm a Jewish person because I identify with it, and not like a person who practices Judaism, right? That would be like that person first. So that makes a lot of sense. But I like that you mentioned that it's complex because different people identify with their disability differently.
Exactly. Yeah. And so the reason that I bring that up is like, A, don't be afraid of using the word, but B, also be cognizant of like what the person that you're talking to or the person you're talking about prefers. Like if a person calls themselves a disabled person, like don't correct them and tell them that they're a person with a disability, because like that happens. Like that's a real thing.
People correcting other people on their own identities is like the thing on the 2020 bingo card I like just didn't really see coming. I mean, most of it has been, but like and I've seen it mostly in race language where people are like, "Oh, you're not Black, you're African American." And have people been like, "I'm from England. Like I'm not like I can just be Black." And that's just an example of something I've seen, but it's like, please stop telling people what their identity is. Across the board, like PSA from the Dear Grad Student podcast, please stop telling people what their identities are and let them just tell you what theirs are and accept it. That's enough.
Yes. Also, snaps over here.
The Snaps podcast.
But like also kind of to go with that is that I think part of the reason why people view disability as a bad thing, like there are tons of reasons. There's like a lot of history, but I think part of it is that we as a society don't really view disability as diversity in the same way that we view other identities. And we have a poll for this.
Yes, I'm living. Give me the polls.
We asked about how many respondents had a multicultural center, and out of 30 respondents, 70% said that their university had one. Out of 29 participants, more than 70% said that their university had an LGBTQ plus center. But then when we asked about a Disability Cultural Center, which is separate from the Disability Services Office, out of 31 respondents, more than 70% said no, there was not a Disability Cultural Center on their campus. And so maybe if we had these cultural centers that sort of elevated disability as like a culture and as a form of diversity, then people wouldn't be as worried about using that word and about identifying with that as part of who they are.
Definitely. It reminds me, I think the Twitter post that I was talking about that I was seeing was like somebody was talking about like a mom group that was talking about like different ways to refer to their children with a disability, their disabled children. See, I'll work on that. It's hard to know, like, I don't know what those children would have wanted to be called, whatever.
Sure,
but like the mom was basically like, my kid's not disabled. They have special needs, or my kid's not disabled. Like they're specially abled. And the person was like, your kid is disabled, and that's not a bad word. And by doing all of these euphemisms, you're making it a bad word. Like you're making part of who they are this like bad thing when it is just a thing that occurs, right? And like not even to call it normal, because that assumes that there is an abnormal, but like it just is. It's a descriptor. It's a adjective.
Yeah.
It like totally reminds me of that, of thinking about it being a bad word. And I even find myself like when I was tweeting about, I think when my past guest Karen Tang spoke at a disability event, because she identifies as disabled, and I remember tweeting about her speaking at it, and like I was retweeting it, and I found myself being like, how do I want to write this? Because obviously it's important to pay attention to how we talk about things, and I'm very aware of it. But also I felt weird the first time I like typed out disabled, and I was like, oh, like, is that, am I wording this in the most inclusive and blah, blah, blah way? And then I was like, that's how she worded it. It's not that. And so I'm still checking myself, because I have those biases of like, it is new to me that disabled is not derogatory, but like minimizing. It is just an adjective.
Well, and I guess while we're talking about that, we haven't addressed the fact that some parts of the disability community, well, I don't know how to phrase this. Sometimes mental health and disability are considered to be like two really distinct things. And I think that is part of the issue in like getting more traction about accessibility in the academy. That, I mean, I know my personal understanding of disability includes mental health, includes mental illness, includes depression and anxiety, that like all of those, if you have those things and you want to identify as disabled, more power to you, because to me those are all under the same umbrella. But I think a lot of the movement towards like mental health and like a mental illness positivity can sometimes isolate those two things. And I think that by separating them, we're sort of like losing maybe some of the power of that movement. And this is not our poll, but this is a research that grad students experience depression and anxiety at significantly higher levels than the rest of the population.
Yes.
And so if anybody's going to make strides here and like make a movement, if we are all inclusive under the same umbrella, I think there is power in those numbers and in making things accessible for everyone.
Definitely. And like, it reminds me, as we think about some universities developing these task forces, I've talked before, I don't think much is going to come of them, simply because I think it's performative activism. But for schools where things are actually happening, or if you are a grad student that has an ability to join one of these, please do not forget disability awareness and actions to promote disability accessibility in your departments. I think that obviously, like you mentioned before, different identities have different needs. Don't forget that. And if you're somebody who is hearing this and you're like, wow, I have a lot of like reflection to do, or I have a lot of awareness to do, as I constantly am trying to, because this is a lot more sort of in my mind as something new compared to, I don't know, I think about like ethnic identities, like being Jewish, that's something that's always been on my mind, but being disabled is a different identity that hasn't been, that this is something to include. I think about if a student in class is asking for extra time or like you see something like that going down, not to necessarily say go to bat for them because that might not be your place. You don't need to be I'm not saying this is all white people, but like you don't need to play the savior role, but just to say that there's things that you can do to promote or advocate within your department. And I know you mentioned, Cait, I think earlier, that there are like email templates that disabled students have for like doing this. I wonder if this exists already. Are there templates for like non-disabled students who as an abled student can come and say things? Like I just wonder if that exists. Is that something that is necessary for abled students to have the ability to be like, hi, this is a problem in my department that I'm not experiencing, but it's a problem that needs to be brought up for current and future students who might be dealing with it? I don't know.
So when for our like daily actions as we were doing in October, when we were writing the email templates, we did try to write them in a way that, it was sort of a standard template, but then you can insert your own details. And so to make it specific to your institution and what your offices are called, but then you could also identify yourself, as a non-disabled ally or as a disabled student. So you could kind of customize the templates that we made to fit your experience.
I'm obsessed. I'm going to be linking that tweet wherever you guys have that linked. I'll put it in the episode description. So anybody listening who's like, I want that kind of template to start these conversations, guess what? It exists. Thanks, guys. And I'll have it linked for sure.
Yeah. I think, you make a good point, and sort of talking about what non-disabled students can do is like, there's a lot of a labor burden for disabled students in, having to be representatives on DEI task force when maybe that's not what they want to do, or they don't feel like they have time or the energy to do that. Or so like a example I can think of is like when everything moved to Zoom, that I have heard a lot of disabled students spend time like advocating for captions on Zooms, for having live captions, and so that's a lot of work from the disabled person's perspective. So that's something that like a non-disabled person could email their department chair and be like, hey, this is an issue that these classes aren't accessible. What can we do to have live captions on all of these classes or these department meetings? And so email templates are one way to do that, but just thinking ways sort of at the more systems level, what can you do to sort of ease this labor burden? And then you can also think of it like as the individual level, say in that situation where a student has extended time on a test and then maybe the professor is giving them a problem, is you could ask the student, in a private place when it's convenient, if you know them, can I do anything to help you? And maybe they can, and maybe there is something they can do to help. But to also accept if the person says, nope, I'm good, then okay, that's great.
I think that acceptance piece is key because I think that kind of like you mentioned, Cait, like I think that there are a lot of well-meaning people. I think there are a lot of well-meaning people who have either not done their research or have not looked at the right sources for what they're trying to go for. And I think that, and I don't know if you guys can identify with this, but like as a white person, we see portrayed in multiple different areas, whether it be a movie of a disabled person. Like, I don't know a lot of movies with disabled people. That's actually interesting as I think about that. Another conversation, I'm sure. But like, it's as a white person, I see a lot of portrayal of white saviorship. And so when somebody says no, being like, no, I'm still going to fight for blah, blah. If they say no, like, just take it. Like, they have told you their needs and their desires, and like, you don't need to violate that.
Yeah.
And I think it feels well-intentioned on their end, but it is not.
Yeah. And like a common sort of example that I see sometimes of that is if someone's in a manual wheelchair, you can ask, do they need help going up this hill? But if they say no, you should not forcibly grab their wheelchair and push them up anyways. Or if a blind person is walking, you can ask, oh, do you need help navigating somewhere, need directions? And if they say no, you should not grab them.
Yeah, no, don't do that. It also made me realize too, like that something I didn't even think about, like somebody who is either, I guess, especially in a manualized wheelchair in this example of like the fact that there are handles on the back. Like I wonder how many people have experienced people just grabbing and being like, let me help you up the hill with not even a question, just being like, oh, I'm, doing a good deed because I helped. It's like, it's not a good deed if they didn't consent to it, dude. Like you just look like a dick.
Yes.
Like, I don't know why I assumed that was a male, but I did. But that's violating their needs and wants and consent is not a good deed.
I saw somebody post on Twitter that they are blind and they went to vote, and one of the poll workers just basically grabbed their arm to help walk them to wherever the polling thing was during a global pandemic of a virus that is very easily transmittable. And so the person was like, you just risked my life to touch me when nobody asked you to do this, right? Like, I'm fine, I got it. If I needed your help, I would have asked for your help. And so there are very real consequences to just putting your body near someone else's body without asking them, right?
Yeah, man, it's violating.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And it's infantilizing. It's like, I know better than you. I know what you
Yes.
need. I know where you need to go. I can help you get there, without really giving any sort of ownership or agency to the disabled person.
Yeah, and I think that agency, I mean, we haven't even fully touched, like, there's so many things we could talk about here, right? When we talk about, like,
Yeah.
you know, kind of similar with, like, a disabled grad student is not a less capable grad student. And even just, like, the unsolicited advice that, again, like, there's this, like, well-meaning thing can be very sour very quickly because people just don't think as far as they should. And, you know, I'm really glad that you brought up polls. I know I've said as we're wrapping up here, this is just going to be 2 episodes, so people listening, you're already in the second one and it's fine. But I'll say, like, I'm glad you brought up polls because, you know, we're recording this on Sunday, November 8th, and yesterday, Joe Biden, a man with a stutter, and the first Black and Indian female vice president, I should say, were, you know, declared president and vice president-elect of the United States. And I would love, before we hit onto final thoughts here, what you think might come of this. Are you feeling hopeful? Is there a sense of, like, there might be some great things done and some great things not done? I'm curious maybe what the disabled community reaction has been, and also, like, what your personal reactions have been. I mean, I know we kind of already talked privately about our political standings. Obviously, the 3 of us are thrilled that this has been the person elected, but in terms of how it is directly affecting the disabled community, I'm kind of curious what might come of this.
Well, so excitingly in his speech, which I don't know if it was, like, technically an acceptance speech, because this year is just so weird.
Did you watch it last night? I watched it.
Yeah.
I was crying.
Yes.
Which sounds dramatic.
Yes. No, I mean, like, every part of last night was just so much. I mean, I read a tweet thread about Kamala's outfit.
Oh,
that it was a pantsuit for Hillary and it was white because of the suffragettes.
I did notice, though, that SNL had the exact outfit replicated in, like, hours later. Literally, it was unbelievable. But anyways.
Anyway, yeah. Well, so, I mean, so I stutter. And so obviously this is, like, very complicated feelings about this whole thing. And I've written Twitter threads about this.
Ooh, I can link them below.
Oh, I mean, it's just going to be, like, pages of links.
I can't wait.
So many links.
Well, now that there's 2 episodes, they can be twice as long as other ones. So
yes!
I'm very excited.
Okay, good. But so, I mean, the way that Joe Biden talks about his stutter, the way that the media talks about it, is that he's overcome it.
It's like, it's not quite inspiration porn. Oh, it is inspiration porn.
I mean, more or less. Yeah.
Which is, should we define that? I don't know if people know what that is.
Yeah. So, I don't even know how to, like, articulately define this, but like inspiration porn is basically whenever you, like, praise or like are inspired by something that a disabled person has done, not because it's inspiring, but because it's inspiring because they're disabled.
And they, like, did something in spite of a disability. It's like, no, they did that because they were forced to because you didn't accommodate them. And now you think that it's really beautiful when it's actually abusive, but that's okay.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, like, the idea of somebody overcoming a stutter is so complex for me because many children stutter developmentally, and so, like, many children just, like, do it while they're figuring out how to speak, and then they just sort of grow out of it.
Yeah.
But for about 1% of the population, it persists. We continue stuttering forever. And if they read my thread, I have all this, like, science info linked there about, like, the areas of the brain involved and blood flow.
Not surprised
and, like,
whatsoever. Obsessed. Very organized. More organized than me.
And so, like, once you stutter persistently, you don't really overcome it. There are things you can do to stutter less, there are ways that you can hide it. And so one of the ways is to covertly stutter, which is basically where you hide it, where you switch the words that you're saying, where you switch the direction of the sentence midway. And it's a pretty common way for people to stutter when they don't want people to know about it. And that's essentially what Joe Biden does. And so for me, I feel like so proud and also angry at this moment that like, I wish that he could have the opportunity to embrace it, because the messages I'm getting are, I'm not valuable unless I hide it, that I need to be working really hard. And it takes a lot of work. It's really, really, really hard to hide it. And so I don't want to. And so I just like stutter freely, and you all just have to be more patient.
Absolutely.
That's just it.
Well, and you're right. I would love for him to just do a speech and stutter through it.
Yes, and I would love that.
And not have you get this thing of Joe Biden got over it and you can too. And it's like, and I don't need to. I could.
Exactly.
You're right, I could. And I don't need to, nor do I want to. So I'm not going to.
Well, and maybe I couldn't, right? It's not that easy. And and like lots of people just can't. No matter how hard you try, you just can't. And that doesn't make me bad or lazy or anything. It just means that like I'm putting that effort towards other things. And so this is a very, very, very long. We are on the first intro sentence still, Kayden. This has just been one long sentence. We haven't moved.
Kayden like stepped away for a minute and came back, and we're still talking about
it. Yeah, like we haven't even done anything yet. But so like I'm so like energized and proud about this, but I'm also so sad because it's ableism that makes it so that he can't, right? It's the fact that all of the outgoing administration has mocked him for it. I'm sure that many of his peers and colleagues have. I know that I encounter it on a daily basis, right? That like just going out and speaking is challenging, and it would just be so amazing if we could just like have him embrace it and not have to feel like he's hiding it. But so in his speech, so now that we finally gotten through that first sentence, in his speech, he actually specifically called out disability and it specifically said that we need to be making the promise of this country or something like that.
For everyone,
For everyone. And he explicitly included disability in there. And then somebody on Twitter tagged Jake Tapper from CNN. And so after the speech last night, Jake Tapper got on air and talked about how the disability community is a political force and we are here and we vote. And he called out the hashtag Crip the Vote, which you should check out on Twitter. It's awesome.
I will link it below.
But I mean, part of why the disabled community was able to vote was because mail-in voting, the access to mail-in voting increased because of COVID. And so I know that you asked earlier about like COVID and access in the academy, but there's also COVID and access in just like our being able to vote, which I mean, there are like other complications to voting for disabled people that just like making mail-in voting isn't going to resolve everything. But so that was really energizing that like in the speech, there was no mocking of disabled people. In fact, it was like uplifting and embracing. But then also earlier you mentioned about how in one of our polls, it's possible that people answered the way that they did because they're on their parents' insurance. And that's only available because of the Affordable Care Act.
Yes.
And that's something that the current administration has been trying to push out and get rid of for their entire 4 years. And now we don't have to worry about that with the incoming administration. But I will point out, on November 10th, which is in 2 days, the ACA is going up in front of the Supreme Court. And so it is on the chopping block this week. And so while yes, the community is excited, we're also scared, right? Like we're also worried that what's going to happen in the next week.
Wow. And I didn't even know about that.
The ACA. Yeah.
by the time the episode comes out, we'll know the outcome of that.
Oh, yeah.
And, anything info-wise about that outcome, either way, I'll also probably link in the episode for people to find out about. Like, I should probably have known that. And like, I am all over Twitter generally, and like, I haven't seen any of that. So even people who are working to be informed are not going to be informed on all points, which, like, fine. Like, it is very hard to be like updated on literally everything, and we're all getting PhDs, and like, this shit's hard. But I think I'll definitely try to get a link for some info for people to sort of like to bring it to more people's awareness. I think that is scary. Wow. Yeah, I can't even get into the Supreme Court right now.
Yes.
I see Kayden responding as well. He also seems very angry at it, so we're collectively a lot of rage here. But I am curious if you had anything, Kayden, in terms of like your thoughts on this incoming administration and what it might mean or perhaps might not mean for the disabled community.
Not specifically about the election of Biden and Harris, but there was, I don't know if it was a record, but I feel like it might have been, of disabled people elected in like Senate and congressional and local elections, that I don't have numbers off the top of my head, but there is, I believe, a thread compiled of people who openly identified as disabled who were elected in races that I can send.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would love to link that again, as like I mentioned way, way, way back hours ago. Representation, it's really important when it comes to like faculty and undergrad seeing disabled faculty and what it means that like they could be a faculty. Same for elected office. And when we talk about like more voices coming to the table with issues that matter for them, more disabled people coming to the table hopefully means additional advocacy that unfortunately is not being done by people who don't own those identities.
I think especially in the wake of Kamala Harris being elected, and the fact that in her speech she specifically called out Black women and Native women and Asian women in a part of her speech. I do want to point out that like we are two white disabled people here, but the disability community and the disability justice movement and the strides that have been made have really been by disabled Black and Indigenous and Asian, like basically disabled people of color are carrying this movement and are really pushing everything forward. And so like, I really don't want to miss highlighting how important the continued contributions of disabled people of color are. And I'm sure that we can like link you to, I mean, we have threads on our group Twitter account highlighting these voices and authors and speakers, because really, really, really the movement would not be where it is without them.
I'm really glad that you brought that up. And I think you mentioned way at the very beginning of the now first episode about the identities that you hold. And I think that it's important. I have seen a lot on Twitter that like, not only are these like political movements being on the back of like Black, Indigenous, people of color otherwise in general, but the disability movement has also. And I think you're right. It's incredibly important to not just credit that, but also to promote those voices. And hopefully we can get some accounts as well that people can follow. I know that I follow a lot of different accounts to get those kind of voices on my timeline so that I'm having those thoughts come up. And I think it's important that we are listening to different voices and certainly giving credit where credit is due. And so as we are actually legitimately wrapping up this time, I swear, we've just had such an important conversation. I really didn't want to cut us off. I want to thank both of you for the hours that you have chatted with me now. I wanted to see, do you want to give like final thoughts? What are like the big takeaways that you hope anybody listening to this episode would take away from the things that we have chatted about today?
So I think the takeaway or like the final thought or the overarching theme for me kind of goes back to that like burn it all down kind of idea.
Yes. Burn it with fire.
Yeah. Well, so the academy is built on this white supremacist, ableist, capitalist, productivity minded structure. And so like, let's just get rid of that, right? Like the only way to really make it a space for disabled people and people from really all sorts of marginalized groups, the only way to really do that is to like tear down all these structures that we have, timed exams. I mean, like the fact that I need accommodations if I want extra time to give a talk. I shouldn't need accommodations for that. You should just listen and be like, oh, okay, it takes you an extra couple minutes. We'll just give you an extra couple minutes.
Yeah.
Like this is not hard for anybody. And like the inherent mistrust that the academy builds in, the inherent mistrust in students that if we're asking for extra time, if we're asking for accommodations, then we're lying. And then like those constant comparisons. I think that trying to break down these structures where there's competition and comparison between grad students, if we can get able grad students to stop this culture of overwork, which I know is hard because it comes from the top down, right?
Yeah.
That like we're getting this culture of overwork from other people. But again, all of these are pieces of this white supremacist, ableist, capitalist productivity structure. And so each of these little pieces, if we can just get rid of it, which I know, I mean, it's like so hard and I don't know how anybody does it, but just burn it all down.
Great. I also think there's something to be said about like accessible rigor, I think is possible. Like we're, at least I am not, and I'm going to assume, but tell me if I'm wrong, like we're not saying that grad school shouldn't challenge us or that grad school and academia shouldn't be constantly looking to progress science and advance ideas and promote progressivism in the sense of like science and ideas. Like obviously, you know, in some cases like curing cancer or curing Alzheimer's, or we're looking at climate change or what have you. And all ideas are important, but just in thinking about those main things, we're not saying to slow that down. We're saying to make it possible for all people to participate in.
Yeah, yeah. And like, how many voices are we missing who are going to be making these really incredible discoveries because they think differently, because they do things differently, because they plan experiments in a different way? Are we missing out on good science because I know that we are. This is a rhetorical thing. But like, how much of that are we missing out on because of this lack of access? Oh, it just makes me angry. Now I'm going to swear.
Yeah, no. And you remind me of, I can't start. We've been recording for 2 hours and 10 minutes and I respect your time, which I have not respected. So Kayden, I'm curious, any like final thoughts, any like big theme ideas or I don't know, things that you want to repeat that you hope people take away as they heard these 2 episodes?
Yeah, I guess some of my final points are to really seek out and listen to the lived experience of disabled people and disabled grad students, and to not assume that just because someone is not visibly disabled that there are not disabled students in the room.
Yeah.
Whether they be your cohort mates or students in the classes that you are teaching. And also, I think it was Cait that you and I might have had this discussion on Twitter a long time ago. But this, the numbers we talked about of 20% of undergrads identifying as disabled and about 8% of graduate students and about 4% of faculty. And then this sort of metaphor that tends to come up in this area, but with a lot of representation of marginalized identities as you sort of move up the academic structure of sort of this idea of like this leaky pipeline, which Cait brought up I think, good point, I believe, that it's not the best analogy because it implies sort of a passive process or that people are leaving because they don't want to, when it's really these numbers are narrowing not because of passive things, but because of active barriers that are put up by, as Cait said, white supremacist, ableist, capitalistic institution, and that you, as a grad student, as an undergrad, as a faculty member, can do things to change that.
Yeah.
And so use the positions and the privileges that you have to learn about disability and be informed by the disabled people in these spaces and not in these spaces to see what you can do to make the academy more accessible for everyone.
Wow. I just had to like absorb that. I feel like that was like my soul is processing that. Like, absolutely. I think that both of you just have wrapped up, especially with the sort of 2 thoughts you both came in here with just so beautifully. Everything that we've talked about over the last couple of hours. Again, I want to apologize for violating the time management rules I said at the beginning, but also to thank you so much for the time that you've put into this. I hope that, you know, everyone listening has made it through these 2 episodes and have hopefully walked away either feeling heard or feeling like they have some reflection to do, depending on where you're coming from as you're hearing this episode. And I just want to thank you both so much for your time. I do want to remind people where they can find you on social media. In episode 1, I would have already done this in my own outro, because obviously we're not going to just randomly cut that in and act like we're fancy. We're not. We're just going to cut it off in the middle. But Kayden and Cait, where can people find you online? Maybe want to give your personal accounts first, and then we'll give that the disability grad student account second.
Sure. So you can find me on Twitter. And my handle is at Kayden Stockwell, KaydenStockwell.
All right, and then you can find me on Twitter. My handle is Kate S. Kirby. That's CaitSKirby. You can also find me on my website. That's KateKirby.com.
And you're on the job market.
I am on the job market. I've been on the job market. The job market is horrible.
Hire Cait. Hire Cait. Hire Cait.
I would like a job, please. Thank you.
Yeah. If I had a job, I would give it to you.
No, but then you wouldn't have a job.
Oh, that's right. But if I had a second one, if I had an opening, job, I would give it. I don't have that either. I'm not in charge of anything.
You have a beautiful podcast. You're in charge of a beautiful podcast.
You're right. I have no funding. I'm in charge of a fundlist podcast. That's okay. We're doing our best. And then where can people find your group account on Twitter?
So our group account on Twitter is Disabled in Grad School, but the handle is actually Dis in Grad School. That's DISINGRADSCHOOL.
Nice.
I feel like I'm at like the doctors right now, and I have to be like, C as in Charlie, A as in Alpha.
I felt that way when I was like first recording my outro, where I like spell my name and my like handle and things like that. I feel like now it's just rote memorization because I've done it so many times. But the very first time I was like, how do I spell my name? Am I spelling my name? And I like got really in my head. It was like when you look at something for too long and you're like, is that how you spell that word? But it was like my own name. So been there, totally relate. Again, thank you both so much for coming and chatting with me today. I look forward to getting this episode out everywhere. Everyone, please go give them a follow. Listeners, again, thank you so much for listening to these 2 monstrous but impactful and important episodes. And I will catch you next time. We did it! 2 episodes, 1 week. I'm not tired, you are. If you want to find more Dear Grad Student, you can find the podcast on social media. You can find the podcast on Twitter at Dear Grad Student, on Instagram at Dear Grad Student Pod, and on YouTube by searching Dear Grad Student Podcast. If you just want to connect with me online, you can find me on Twitter at Alana_Gloger. That's ELANA_GLOGER. And if you like what you heard on the podcast today, catch up on all of your missed episodes. I know I keep saying this, but really, I have a whole semester worth of tips and tricks and commiseration and celebration all about grad school. Send an episode to a friend. We all just need a little bit of community around this time of year. Plus, word of mouth really helps the podcast. And if you can, please rate and leave a review for Dear Grad Student on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or, wherever you find your other favorite shows. Reminder that all of the resources and links mentioned in today's episode can be found in the description. And until next time, warmest regards, best wishes, sincerely, Alana.